This video presents part one of a two-part presentation titled Compound Attacks. Part one presents a review of concepts and principles related to compound attacks, and part two presents a solo drill titled Double-Feint attacks. Overview, Part 1. We'll begin by considering general concepts related to changes of line. First, we'll examine the definition of the four lines of attack and defense as delineated in fencing. Then, we'll look at the definition of the disengage or dégagement and the counter-disengage or contre-dégagement. Note that the term disengage is often used in a general way to encompass both of these concepts. Then we'll move on to consider how disengages and counter-disengages can be combined with thrusts and other actions to build compound attacks. In particular, we'll examine first single feint compound attacks and then double feint compound attacks. In fencing, the term line is used in two distinctly different ways. We may speak of four lines or quadrants of attack and defense, which are defined in terms of the parries that would be used to defend against an attack in that line. So the four lines or quadrants in this sense would be described as the line of 4, the line of 6, the line of 7, the line of 8. On the other hand, we may speak of lines as ranges of movement. If an attack begins in one line and finishes in another, then the range of movement of the action can be defined in relation to the opponent's guard. We may move within the high line above the opponent's guard, the low line below the opponent's guard, the inside line, or the outside line. This concept is illustrated here where we represent the four quadrants or parry positions as presented to us when we face a right-handed opponent. So as we can see, the high line would be above the opponent's guard as represented by the center of the cross here. The low line would be the positions below the opponent's guard, corresponding to parries 7 or 8. The outside line would be on the outside of the opponent's guard, that is the side towards the opponent's shoulder or flank, as opposed to the inside on the side of the opponent's chest or belly. Once again, the handedness of the opponent influences the way that the lines of attack and defense are defined. So if instead of a right-handed opponent, we face a left-handed one, we will see that the inside and outside lines have switched. The high and low lines, of course, are defined in the same way. Now the outside line, still aligned with the opponent's shoulder, is on the opposite side from what it would be for a right-handed fencer. For the remainder of this presentation, we'll assume that we're facing a right-handed opponent, since that's the most common situation any of us do face. Let's look more closely at the various types of changes of line. The disengage, or dégagement, is a movement of your blade which evades a lateral or vertical parry or other Attempt at engagement of your blade by your opponent. Disengage begins in one line of attack and ends in another. The counter disengage, or contre-dégagement, is a movement that evades a circular parry or attempted engagement. It begins and ends in the same line of attack, as we shall see. So let's look at an illustration of changes of line, disengages and counter disengagements in the 4 lines of movement. We'll be looking at the difference between lateral disengages, vertical disengages, and counter disengages, and how each of these is performed within the various lines of movement: high, outside, low, and inside. To illustrate this, we'll be using some simple animations of the type that we'll use as visual cues later on as we guide you through progressively more complex bladework drills. So this is a good time to grab your weapon and start to follow along as we guide you through the simplest of movements. A lateral disengage in the high line, beginning in the opponent's outside high line or line of 6, evades a parry 6, arrives in the line of 4, and if accompanied by a thrust, results in a touch. If one begins in the inside high line or the line of 4, the action is performed in the opposite direction, evading a parry 4 to arrive in the outside high line. Counter disengage in the high line, beginning in the line of 6, would evade a circular 4 parry and arrive back in the outside high line. If we begin instead in the inside high line or the line of 4, evading a circular 6 parry, we arrive back in the inside high line. Now let's consider what happens if we confine ourselves to the outside line, the lines of 6 and 8. If we begin in the line of 6, then to evade a parry 6, we simply drop our point into the line of 8. If we begin in 8, to avoid the parry in 8, we simply raise our point into the high line, arriving in the outside high line. The counter disengage in the outside line, beginning in the opponent's line of 6, evades a circular 4 parry and arrives back in the outside high line. Beginning in the outside low line, the opponent's line of 8, the counter disengage evades a circular 7 or sweeping circular 6 parry to arrive back in the outside low line. The lateral disengage in the low line from the opponent's line of 8 evades the parry 8, transferring over the top of the opponent's blade and back into the inside low line. From the opponent's line of 7, we evade the parry 7 with a lateral disengage into the outside low line or line of 8. Counter disengages in the low line involve evading from the line of 8 a circular 7 or sweeping 6 parry to arrive back in the original line. Likewise, if we begin in the inside low line or the quadrant of 7, then we can evade a circular 8 or sweeping 4 parry to arrive back in the inside low line. Now let's consider vertical disengages in the inside line. Beginning in the line of 4, we evade the parry 4 simply by dropping our point to the low line. If we begin in the line of 7, we can avoid the parry 7 by raising our point and arriving in the line of 4. A counter disengage from the line of 4 evades a circular 6 parry and arrives back in the inside high line. It can, if we begin in the inside low line, we avoid a circular 8 parry and arrive back in the original line. Now that we've familiarized ourselves with the visual representation, we'll be using and illustrating the various actions as we go forward. Let's turn our attention to some of the basic principles that should guide us in the way that we execute these actions. First, let's consider the issue of attack versus preparation. We may describe as an indirect thrust a disengage that's executed as part of a simple indirect action. That is to say, one action in which a thrust and a change of line are performed simultaneously in order to arrive in a different line and hit the target. Such an action is executed as a forward spiral, and in this case, the disengage is an integral part of the attack. In contrast, the disengage thrust is a compound action, a disengage executed without any forward movement, followed by a separate thrusting action. In this case, the disengage is a mere preparation. It's not part of the attack, which starts when the forward movement of the thrust begins. Let's consider now the question of technique, that is, how an indirect thrust should be properly executed. Each indirect thrust should be small, dynamic, precise, and emphatic. And when we perform the indirect thrust, we should lead with the point. The movement of the point should be small, just enough to evade the opponent's blade. Dynamic, spiraling forward rather than circling in place. Precise, the point should snap into the new line, into a definite position, not waggle about in a vague way when it arrives. And emphatic, making a convincing feint or a solid hit. Once again, and always, lead with the point. Now, in contrast to the simple attacks that we've been describing, involving one single motion, let's consider the topic of compound attacks, which are built out of a series of different motions. Compound attacks include single feint attacks, in which a feint is followed by the final thrust to hit the target. There are two types of single feint attacks: the 1-2, which involves two changes of line in opposite directions, and the double, which involves two changes of line in the same direction. Double feint attacks can then be built by adding an additional disengage or contra-disengage after the 1-2 or the double. So the single feint attack is built by stringing together, as we've said, a disengage followed by a second disengage to make a 1-2, or by following the disengage with a counter disengage continuing in the same direction, making a complete circle to arrive again in the original line, the double. Now let's see what that looks like in our visual scheme. So the 1-2 in the high line, beginning in the opponent's line of 6. begins with a feint into the inside high line, here represented by a black dot as opposed to the target, and then is followed up with the disengage in the opposite direction to arrive at the target and hit. The double in the high line, again beginning in the opponent's line of 6, begins with the same feint into the inside high line, but then continues in the same direction, making a complete circle to finish again in the inside high line. The 1-2 in the outside line from the opponent's line of 6 is a vertical disengage, followed by another vertical disengage in the opposite direction. The double in the outside line is a vertical disengage, followed by a counter disengage. The 1-2 in the low line from the opponent's line of 8 involves a disengage in which the point rises above the opponent's blade and drops back into the low line, followed by another disengage in the opposite direction, arriving in the line of 8. The double in the low line involves, again, a disengage into the inside low line, then followed by a counter disengage which continues the spiral and arrives back in the inside low line. The 1-2 in the inside line from the opponent's line of 4 involves a vertical disengage into the low line and another to return to the high line. The double in the inside line from the opponent's line of 4 begins with the vertical disengage again, and then the double. Having presented a picture of single feint attacks in various lines, it should now be easier to see how double feint attacks can be constructed by combining various types of disengage and counter disengage. For example, the 1-2 can be followed by an additional disengage, again with a change of direction, to create a 1-2-3. The 1-2 can also be followed with a counter disengage, continuing in the same direction. And this 1-2 counter disengage can also be described as a disengage followed by a double, or dégage et double. Double feint attacks can be built from the double as well. If we begin with a double and add yet another counter disengage so that we have a series of 2 feints and a final thrust, all combined with a change of line in the same direction, spiraling forward, we have the triple. If after the double we execute a disengage in the opposite direction, we have the double et dégage. Having presented definitions of the various types of double feint attacks, we can now describe a drill which applies this knowledge by systematically working through all 4 types of double feint attack in each of the 4 lines of movement. In each line, we begin in one quadrant and execute a triple, a double et dégage, a 1-2-3, and a dégage et double. Then, switching to the opposite quadrant, we reverse direction, executing a dégage et double, a 1-2-3, a double et dégage, and a triple. Admittedly, this may all sound a little abstract. I hope that when we present this visually, it will seem much more straightforward. The drill itself is presented in a brief, separate companion video titled Solo Drill, Double-Feint Attacks. It features a series of simple animations based on the graphics and the terminology presented here. Please check it out. We hope you enjoy it.